Commerce Alive today presents
Continental Airlines. Varney Speed Lines, named after one of its initial owners, Walter T. Varney, who was also a founder of United Airlines, was formed in 1934, operating airmail and passenger services in the American Southwest over a route originating from El Paso and extending through Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Las Vegas, New Mexico, to Pueblo, Colorado. The airline commenced operations with the Lockheed Vega, a single-engine plane that carried 4 passengers. Varney was awarded a 17-cent rate airmail contract between Pueblo and El Paso. It carried passengers as a sideline. Following cancellation of all domestic airmail contracts by the Roosevelt administration in 1934, Robert F. Six learned of an opportunity to buy into the Southwest division of Varney Speed Lines, which needed money to handle its newly won Pueblo-El Paso route. Six was introduced to Louis Muller, who would serve as chairman of the board of Continental until February 28, 1966. Muller had helped found the Southwest Division of Varney in 1934 with Walter T. Varney. As an upshot of all this, Six bought into the airline with $90,000 and became general manager on July 5, 1936. The carrier was renamed Continental Airlines, later changed to Airlines on July 8, 1937. Six relocated the airline's headquarters to Denver Union, later Stapleton Airport in Denver, in October 1937. Six changed the name to Continental because he wanted the airline name to reflect his desire to have the airline fly all directions throughout the United States. During World War II, Continental's Denver maintenance base converted Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, Boeing B-29 Superfortresses, and North American P-51 Mustangs for the United States Army Air Forces. Profits from military transportation and aircraft conversion enabled Continental to contemplate expansion and acquisition of new airliners after the war. Among those were the Douglas DC-3, the Convair 240 and the Convair 340. The Convairs were Continental's first pressurized airliners. The airline's early route was El Paso to Albuquerque and Denver, with routes being added during the war from Denver, Albuquerque, and El Paso eastward across Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. In 1946, Continental flew Denver to Kansas City, Wichita, Tulsa, and to Oklahoma City, and from El Paso and Albuquerque to San Antonio. Each route included stops in several of 22 smaller cities. In the early 1950s, Continental began several interchange routes with American, Braniff, and United Airlines. Routes were operated on American from Los Angeles and San Francisco to El Paso, continuing on to Continental's route to San Antonio and Houston. Continental's Denver to Kansas City route would interchange on to St. Louis with Braniff Airways, and United's routes from Seattle and Portland to Denver would interchange with Continental's routes on to Wichita and Tulsa. These interchange routes continued for many years until Continental was able to secure routes of its own between each city. In 1955, Continental merged with Pioneer Airlines, gaining access to 16 more cities in Texas and New Mexico. In August 1953, Continental flew to 35 airports and Pioneer flew to 19, but Continental's network didn't reach beyond Denver, El Paso, Houston, and Kansas City until April 1957, when it started Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, 2 Douglas DC-7Bs a day each way. Pioneer's executive vice president Harding Luther Lawrence arrived at Continental as a result of the merger. Bob Six commented on more than one occasion that, "The reason we bought Pioneer was to get Harding." Harding Lawrence implemented several innovative changes at Continental, as well as a flamboyant advertising campaign during his 10 years as Six's protege. During Lawrence's tenure, Continental grew by 500%. Lawrence left Continental in April 1965 to head Braniff Airways. Six petitioned the Civil Aeronautics Board for longer routes to larger cities, hoping to transform the regional into a trunkline like United Airlines, TWA, and American Airlines. He was discussing with Boeing for Continental to become one of the first to operate the soon-to-be-launched 707. The timing was crucial, since new routes would justify the 707s, and vice versa. Continental Airlines had seen a broad expansion of its routes, thanks to a responsive cab and persistent efforts by Six and Executive Vice President Harding Lawrence, who came to Continental in the Pioneer merger, who both frequently referred to his company as the airline that needs to grow. In 1958, Continental began turboprop flights with the Vickers Viscount on the new medium-haul routes. The British-manufactured Viscount 4-engine turboprop, which Continental referred to as the Jet Power Viscount 2, was the first turbine-powered aircraft operated by the airline, with Continental claiming it was first in the West with jet power flights. The cab permitted Continental to drop service at many smaller cities, enabling the carrier's new aircraft to operate more economically on longer flights. In 1960, Continental flew more than 3 times the passenger miles it had in 1956. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, Six was the airline industry's leading lower fare advocate. He predicted that increased traffic, not higher fares, was the answer to the airline industry's problems. To amazement from the industry, he introduced the economy fare on the Chicago-Los Angeles route in 1962. He later pioneered a number of other low or discount fares which made air travel available to many who could not previously afford it. One of Continental's early innovations was a system-wide economy excursion fare which cut the standard coach fares by more than 25%. Continental took delivery of the first of 5 707-124s in spring 1959, and started Chicago-Los Angeles nonstop on June 8. Having so few jets, Continental needed radical innovations to the 707 maintenance program. It developed the Progressive Maintenance Program, which enabled Continental to fly its 707 fleet 7 days a week, achieving greater aircraft utilization than any other jet operator in the industry. On May 22, 1962, Thomas Doty, a passenger intent on having his wife claim money from life insurance, boarded Flight 11 with a bomb, which departed Chicago O'Hare, destined for Kansas City Municipal Airport. The bomb exploded, breaking off the aircraft's tail, and the plane crashed on a farm near Unionville, Missouri. All 45 on board died, including the suicide bomber. This aircraft had previously been subject to an attempted hijacking to Cuba, although the hijackers were captured in El Paso, Texas. In the early 1960s, Continental added flights from Los Angeles to Houston, nonstop, as well as via Phoenix, Tucson, El Paso, Midland, Odessa, Austin, and/or San Antonio. In 1963, the company headquarters moved from Denver to Los Angeles. By late 1963, Continental had discontinued service to most of its smaller cities in Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas, with the exception of Lawton, OK, and Wichita Falls, Texas, which continued operating with DC-9 and 727 jets until 1977. Total passenger miles in 1967 were more than 5 times greater than in 1960, but 61% of the 1967 total was on unscheduled flights. On July 1, 1965, Continental Airlines Flight 12, a Boeing 707-100, ran off the runway at Kansas City Downtown Airport, landing in heavy rain. All 66 on board survived, however the aircraft broke apart in several places and was a total loss. During the late 1960s, the company disposed of the last of its turboprop and piston-powered aircraft, one of the first U.S. airlines to do so. Continental replaced the Viscount fleet with Douglas DC-910s and then added Boeing 727-100s and 727-200s. The DC-9 and 727 were to become the workhorses of the fleet from the late 1960s. The DC-9s were phased out by the late 1970s, although the type reappeared after mergers in the 1980s, with an example being Texas International Airlines DC-9s, which were added to the CO fleet. The 727-200 was the mainstay of its narrow-body fleet until the late 1980s. In 1968, a new livery was launched, orange and gold cheat lines on a white fuselage, and a black Jetstream logo by Six's friend, the noted graphic designer Saul Bass, on the iconic golden tails of the airline's aircraft. The slogans adopted in 1968 and used for more than a decade were, "The airline that pride built" and "The proud bird with the golden tail." 1960 saw international routes awarded to Continental to New Zealand and Australia in the Trans-Pacific case, but they were cancelled by the Nixon administration. During the Vietnam War, Continental provided extensive cargo and troop transportation for United States Army and Marine Corps forces to Asian and the Pacific bases. Continental's long-range Boeing 707-324CS were the most common non-military aircraft transiting Saigon Tan Son Nhat Airport. In 1967, 39% of CO's passenger miles were on scheduled flights. With Continental's experience in Pacific operations, the carrier formed subsidiary Air Micronesia in May 1968, inaugurating island-hopping routes between Yap/Saipan/Guam, Majuro, Rota, Truk, Pohnpei, and Honolulu. Air Mic, as it was known, initially operated with Boeing 727-100 aircraft with open ocean survival gear, Doppler radar, and a large complement of spare parts including tires. A senior mechanic flew on every Air Mic flight until the late 1970s. Air Micronesia operated as subsidiary Continental Micronesia until 2010. In September 1969, Continental began flights from Los Angeles to Honolulu/Hilo and 1 month later from Albuquerque to Chicago, San Antonio, and San Francisco. In 1970, Continental was awarded routes from Seattle and Portland to San Jose, Hollywood Burbank Airport, and Ontario, California, all of them growing markets. In 1963, Continental denied employment to African-American pilot and Air Force veteran, Marlon D. Green. A United States Supreme Court decision allowed a Colorado anti-discrimination law to be applied to his case against Continental. Green flew with Continental for 13 years from 1965 until his retirement in 1978. His employment paved the way for the hiring of ethnic minority pilots by all U.S. carriers, an industry milestone which was finally realized in 1977 after Southern Airways hired their first minority pilot. At Six's insistence, Continental with Pan Am and Trans World Airlines was one of the 3 launch airlines for the Boeing 747. On June 26, 1970, Continental became the second carrier after TWA to put the 747 into U.S. domestic service. Its upper deck first-class lounge and main deck Polynesian pub won awards worldwide for the most refined cabin interior among all airlines, as did meal services developed by Continental's cordon bleu-trained executive chef, Lucien de Kaiser. Continental's 747 services from Chicago and Denver to Los Angeles and Honolulu set the standard for service in the western U.S. On August 4, 1971, Continental Airlines Flight 712, on a flight coming from Hilo International Airport into Los Angeles International Airport, collided in midair over Compton with a Cessna 150 at about 3,950 feet during an evening approach to LAX. The Boeing suffered substantial damage to the outer right-wing panel but landed safely. The Cessna 150 crashed and was destroyed, but both occupants survived with injuries. On June 1, 1972, Continental's wide-body DC-10 service began. Six had insisted that Continental place a large order for DC-10s with manufacturer McDonnell Douglas. This decision again proved prescient, since the publicity associated with Continental's splashy 747 service Chicago-Denver-Los Angeles-Honolulu had stimulated increased market share and increased traffic for all carriers. Denver, Houston and Seattle were growing rapidly in the 1970s. The DC-10s took over most flights between Denver and Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, and Seattle, and between Houston and Los Angeles. During the 1970s, Denver served as the airline's main hub. The 747s were focused on the Chicago-Los Angeles-Honolulu routes, with one daily round trip through Denver. The DC-10s served large markets: Los Angeles to Chicago, Denver, Houston and Honolulu, and from Denver to Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Houston. DC-9s and 727s predominated elsewhere and added frequencies on DC-10 routes. Next to Braniff, Continental operated fewer aircraft types during this period than any U.S. trunk line, affording savings in parts, maintenance, and crew training. The DC-10 enabled the airline to capitalize on traffic growth in the West. Continental saw market share grows annually in each DC-10 market through the 1970s, until relative market parity was achieved with United, the principal competitor on most of the DC-10 routes. The same innovations introduced on the 747s appeared on Continental's DC-10s, including the Polynesian pub, but after the 1973 oil crisis more seats were needed and the DC-10 pubs were removed. Continental phased out its 747s in 1978 in favor of the DC-10. 747s would return to Continental during the Lorenzo era, flying Newark to London and Paris. From the mid-1970s until it merged with Texas International, Continental operated only DC-10s, 727-100S, and 727-200S. On April 13, 1973, after bringing Bob and Audrey Six to their Colorado ranch, the Sabreliner crew departed Montrose Regional Airport for the return flight to Los Angeles. The thrust reverser of the aircraft was deployed in flight shortly after takeoff. The aircraft descended from 1,000 feet, struck the ground, and was destroyed. On August 7, 1975, Flight 426, bound for Wichita, Kansas, crashed near the departure end of runway shortly after takeoff from Denver Stapleton International Airport. The aircraft encountered severe wind shear at an altitude and airspeed which precluded recovery to level flight. The aircraft descended at a rate which could not be overcome even though the aircraft was flown at or near its maximum lift capability throughout the encounter. The wind shear was generated by the outflow from a thunderstorm which was over the aircraft's departure path. All passengers and crew were safely evacuated. The aircraft, a Boeing 727, was a total loss. After years of delays and legal proceedings, Continental started flights between Houston and Miami, and on May 21, 1976, Continental was authorized to operate long-sought routes between San Diego and Denver. President Jimmy Carter and Civil Aeronautics Board Chairman Alfred Kahn had been promoting deregulation of the airline industry, which would dissolve the cab and for the first time in industry history allow U.S. carriers to determine without government supervision where they would fly, and how much they could charge. Continental began flights from Denver to Miami featuring Lauderdale and Tampa St. Petersburg in Florida. That year, President Carter authorized Continental to begin daily round trips between Air Micronesia destination Saipan and Japan, and approved a route for Continental from Los Angeles to Australia via Honolulu, American Samoa, Fiji, New Zealand, and Australia. On March 1, 1978, Flight 603 was scheduled to Honolulu, Hawaii from Los Angeles. At takeoff, the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 overran the runway at Los Angeles when the takeoff was aborted as a result of a tire explosion. The resulting overrun caused a fire that engulfed the aircraft. The aircraft was a total loss. 2 passengers died when they evacuated the aircraft directly into the fire. 2 other passengers died 3 months later of their injuries. The South Pacific service began May 1, 1979. After the 1978 passage of the Airline Deregulation Act, Continental embarked on a route expansion. October 1978 saw Continental begin flights from the New York area airports to Houston and Denver, and from Denver to Phoenix. That month Continental started DC-10 flights between Los Angeles and Taipei, via Honolulu and Guam. Service between Houston and Washington, D.C., began in January 1979. In June 1979, Continental linked Denver with Washington, D.C., Las Vegas, San Francisco and San Jose, and also began Houston-Tampa service. The airline suffered in 1979 when the DC-10 was grounded nationwide following the crash of American Airlines Flight 191. Continental Airlines only operated the DC-10 and the 727 at the time, so flights to Hawaii were canceled during the grounding. By the time of the Texas Air Corporation acquisition in 1981, Continental's post-deregulation growth had allowed it to penetrate every major U.S. airline market and all of the regional markets from the hubs in Denver and Houston, with the corresponding expansion of facilities at both of these airports. But that growth came at the cost of continuing losses. In Denver, Continental's rapid growth provided the final impetus for the construction of the new Denver International Airport, which would be completed almost 15 years later. While deregulation allowed Continental to expand into new areas, it hurt the company's existing business as consumers were for the first time able to choose lower fares over Continental's better service. In 1978, Continental and Western Airlines, which held a nearby headquarters and similar fleet, began a nearly 3-year attempt to merge. The route systems would have been complementary, with little overlap, although they both served the western states. Continental had strength in Hawaii, Southern Tier and the Great Plains states. Western strengths were in the California interstate market, Alaska, Mexico, and the Intermountain West. Both airlines served the Pacific Northwest and Rocky Mountain states, but along different routes from Los Angeles, Denver, San Francisco, Seattle, and Phoenix. The merger attempt failed when Texas Air Corporation interceded with its acquisition of Continental. With the Airline Deregulation Act, the world changed for Continental, as noted by Smithsonian Historian R. For example, Davies. Unfortunately, the policies that had been successful for more than 40 years under Robert Six's cavalier style of management were suddenly laid bare as the cold winds of airline deregulation changed all the rules, specifically, the balance between revenues and expenditures. In 1981, Texas Air Corporation, an airline holding company controlled by U.S. aviation entrepreneur Frank Lorenzo, acquired Continental after a contentious battle with Continental's management, who were determined to resist Lorenzo. Management teamed with unions to create a planned employee stock ownership plan that would have doubled the number of outstanding shares without shareholder approval, thus diluting Texas Air's ownership stake and maintaining control of the airline. But management lost the legal battle to enact the ESOP without shareholder approval, and with its 48.5% ownership stake, Texas Air could win any shareholder vote. During the struggle, in August 1981, Continental Airlines CEO Alvin Feldman died from suicide in his office and was succeeded by George Ward. In 3 letters left to his children, Feldman said he had been depressed since the death of his wife the previous year. Lorenzo became Continental chairman and CEO in March 1982. He and his team viewed the company as stuck in the pre-deregulation era and in need of serious changes to be competitive. Continental was experiencing significant financial challenges both before and after Texas Air's takeover, and management showed how Continental could not compete and survive with its cost structure. The pilots' union agreed to some cost reductions in mid-1982, primarily through modest productivity improvements, but there was no progress with the other unions. On October 31, 1982, following approval by shareholders of both companies, Continental merged operations with Texas International, retaining the Continental identity and offering service to 4 continents: North and South America, Asia and Australia, with a fleet of 112 aircraft. Continental launched its frequent flyer program, initially called Travel Bank, in September 1982, following that of Texas International Airlines in 1979, which was the industry's first frequent flyer program, and American Airlines Advantage program in 1981. In mid-1983, Continental relocated its headquarters to Texas International's base in Houston, Texas, which resulted in a large expansion of its hub at Houston Intercontinental Airport and extensive new routes to Mexico and the south-central U.S. Even with the cost reductions from the pilots in 1982, Continental faced a major competitive threat in 1983 when American Airlines was able to implement 2-tier wage structures with its unions. American planned massive, rapid growth through new hires at starting pay 50% lower than existing contracts and equitable with low-cost, startup carriers and well below Continental's pay rates. American was already one of Continental's main competitors, operating a larger hub 250 miles north of Continental's southern hub in Houston, and the growth that was funded by the lower pay rates was larger than all of Continental at the time. In 1983, Continental went to its unions to restructure labor costs to compete with the startup carriers and American's Plan B labor costs. After 19 months of negotiations, the International Association of Mechanics and Aerospace Workers went on strike in August 1983, even though the company was offering 20% pay raises in return for substantial productivity improvements. Continental was able to operate through the strike because many mechanics crossed picket lines and Continental hired new mechanics. The company continued to negotiate with the pilots and flight attendants, and management gave a final proposal to its pilots in mid-September, which would have provided ownership by the pilots and other employees of 35% of the company's stock in return for meaningful wage and productivity changes. With no agreement, Continental filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy on September 24, 1983, and shut down for 3 days. Continental was the first airline to file for bankruptcy with a plan to continue operating as it did continuously start September 27, 1983. Airline unions fought Continental at every step. On October 1, 1983, the pilots and flight attendants joined the IAM, which was still on strike. When Continental resumed service 3 days after filing Chapter 11, it initially served 25 cities versus the more than 70 cities previously. In the initial stages of bankruptcy, with no legal agreement that would allow travel agents to book flights, passengers could only book directly with the airline. And, with no credit card agreements, Continental could only accept cash for travel. Continental began offering flights for only $49 for each non-stop segment, raising it later to $75 on any segment. In the federal courts, the unions unsuccessfully sued to stop the company's reorganization. They were later successful in working to persuade Congress to pass a new bankruptcy law preventing bankrupt companies from terminating contracts, as Continental had successfully done, but the law was too late to affect Continental. Chapter 11 saved the company from liquidation, but required substantial reorganization, which began immediately. Following bankruptcy, Continental was freed of its obligations and imposed a series of new agreements on its union workers, sharply reducing the airline's labor costs. Continental's senior management also reduced their salaries to those of the pilots. The pilot strike was ultimately unsuccessful due to Continental pilots and new hires who crossed the picket line, and customers who voted with their pocketbook. Continental became vastly more competitive with the new airline startups than emerging and thriving in the southwestern U.S. By the end of 1984, Continental had grown back to be a larger airline than pre-bankruptcy, and that year recorded a $50 million profit. Continental was the first airline to largely gradually replace a pilot workforce, and the working pilots ultimately voted the union out. On April 28, 1985, Continental inaugurated its first scheduled service to Europe with flights from Houston to London/Gatwick. Additional service from Newark to London and Paris started after the airline's merger with People Express Airlines in 1987. With that merger came significant customer service issues, especially in the Northeast, for a period of time. In October 1985, Texas Air Corporation made an offer for a Denver-based regional carrier, Frontier Airlines, opening a bidding war with People Express, which was headed by Lorenzo's former Texas International associate Don Burr. People Express paid a substantial premium for Frontier's high-cost operation. The acquisition, funded by debt, did not seem rational to industry observers from either the route integration or the operating philosophy points of view. On August 24, 1986, Frontier filed for bankruptcy and ceased operations. With People Express losing money, Texas Air announced the acquisition of People Express on September 15, 1986, at the same time gaining Frontier, whose strong network in the Great Plains and Intermountain West reinforced Continental's already formidable Denver hub. The People Express acquisition also provided the option to acquire Terminal C at Newark Liberty International Airport and allow Continental to build a formidable hub in the New York market. With a reorganization plan that repaid creditors 100%, Continental emerged from bankruptcy on June 30, 1986, with improved asset and cash flow positions and a more competitive route structure with routes radiating to every large U.S. city from major hubs at Denver and Houston. Continental also began developing its Midwest hub at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport in 1986, just as United Airlines began to transfer its Cleveland hub operations to Washington Dulles International Airport in Fairfax County, Virginia. In October 1986, American Airlines Senior Vice President Thomas G. Plaskett became the president and CEO of Continental Airlines. On February 1, 1987, People Express, Frontier, New York Air, and several commuter carriers were merged into Continental Airlines to create the sixth largest airline in the world and became the largest low-fare airline by introducing the industry's first non-refundable airfares, initially called Max Savers. The mergers and the aggressive marketing led to Continental becoming an even larger player in the northeastern markets. On July 8, 1987, a Continental Boeing 747 had a near collision with an off-course Delta Air Lines Lockheed L-1011. Both the Delta and Continental London Newark were heading to the U.S., with a total of nearly 600 people on board. The Delta flight strayed 60 miles off course during its flight, and came within 30 feet of colliding with the 747 as the L-1011 flew under it in Canadian airspace. It was potentially the deadliest aviation accident in history. Delta pilots attempted to convince the Continental crew to cover up the incident and not report it. On November 15, 1987, Flight 1713 bound for Boise, Idaho, crashed while taking off in a snowstorm from Stapleton International Airport in Denver, Colorado, on November 15, 1987. The Douglas DC-9 airliner, operated by Continental Airlines, was making a scheduled flight to Boise, Idaho. 25 passengers and 3 crew members died in the crash. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation of the accident determined that the most probable cause of the accident was a combination of things: the failure on the part of the pilot in command to have the aircraft deiced a second time before takeoff, over-rotation on takeoff by the first officer, and flight crew inexperience. In July 1987, Plaskett resigned and Lorenzo returned to the position of CEO. 1987 saw the creation of Continental's one-pass frequent flyer program jointly with Eastern Airlines, and, in 1988, Continental formed its first strategic partnership and the first international airline alliance of its kind with Scandinavian Airlines system. Continental also made a major image change with a blue and gray livery and the globe logo that was adopted by the post-merger United Airlines. The airline also eliminated first-class service, and only the second global carrier to take that action, giving business-class passengers the same first-class seats, a service change later to be marketed as Business First. On August 3, 1990, Scandinavian Airlines System and Texas Air announced that Jet Capital Corporation, which owned controlling interest in Texas Air, was selling its interest to SAS. Under the agreements, Lorenzo would be leaving the active management of the airline as CEO for the first time in 18 years and would remain on the board of directors for 2 further years. At the same time, Hollis Harris, formerly president of Delta Air Lines, was named chairman and chief executive officer. On December 3, 1990, due to the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the resultant Gulf War, which had prompted a dramatic increase in the price of jet fuel, Continental filed for bankruptcy. In mid-1991, Harris was replaced as CEO by Robert Ferguson, who had been a Texas Air executive. In November 1992, Continental accepted a $450 million buyout offer from an investor group composed of Air Partners, an investor from Texas led by Texas Pacific Group, and Air Canada. Under the arrangements, Air Canada would have 24% of the voting stock, while Air Partners would hold 41% of voting interest in the reorganized Continental. Continental emerged from bankruptcy in April 1993. In March 1993, the airline canceled its services to 9 U.S. destinations and 6 non-U.S. destinations, including all 24 weekly services between the United States and Australia and New Zealand in addition to its flights between Guam and Australia, effective October 31 of that year. In 1994, Continental substantially reduced its jet services in Denver and terminated all turboprop operations, which had been unprofitable, reducing Denver from being a hub to a spoke city. On March 2, 1994, Flight 795, a McDonnell Douglas MD-82, suffered damage due to a rejected takeoff from runway 13 at LaGuardia Airport during wintry conditions. The aircraft failed to take off and came to a stop at the edge of a ditch near the runway. 30 passengers and crew suffered minor injuries. Between 1993 and 1995, Continental experimented with an airline within an airline by launching CA Light, later renamed Continental Light, which provided all-economy, low-fare, no-frills service between primarily leisure destinations. Continental Light operated with a dedicated fleet of 100 McDonnell Douglas DC-9-30, Boeing 737-300, and Boeing 737-500 aircraft, each repainted with the Light livery and stripped of its first-class cabin. The service was based primarily at Continental's existing hub in Cleveland as well as a new hub established in Greensboro, North Carolina. The experiment proved unsuccessful and was dissolved in 1995. Continental's short-lived Greensboro hub was dismantled in the process. During this time period, Continental was the subject of hostile takeover bids submitted by Delta Air Lines and Northwest Airlines. Former Boeing executive Gordon Batoon became president and CEO in October 1994 and was elected chairman of the board of directors in 1996. Continental went from being ranked last in most performance categories to winning more J.D. Power and Associates awards for customer satisfaction than any other airline. Businessweek magazine named Batoon one of the top 25 global managers in 1996 and 1997. Under his leadership, Continental's stock price rose from $2 to over $50 per share. Fortune named Continental among the 100 best companies to work for in America for 6 consecutive years. In his final year piloting the airline, Fortune magazine ranked Continental 2004's #1 most admired global airline, a title it earned again in 2005, 2006, 2007 and 2008. While at Continental, Batoon created the Go Forward plan to fix problems with the airline, which included employee morale, the quality of the product, and the route structure, among others. Batoon began by ordering new aircraft in an effort to convert to an all-Boeing fleet. Beginning in 1998, Continental again embarked on a program to expand its international operations. It inaugurated services to Ireland and Scotland, and in October 1998 the airline received its first Boeing 777-200 aircraft, allowing non-stop flights from Newark and Houston to Tokyo Narita, and from Newark to Tel Aviv, Israel. Continental in the same year launched partnerships with Northwest Airlines, Copa Airlines, Avan Airlines, Transbrasil, and Cape Air, and Continental and America West Airlines became the first 2 U.S. airlines to launch interline electronic ticketing. In 1999, Continental Airlines started service between Newark and Zurich, Switzerland, and from Cleveland to London. On July 25, 2000, the official investigation found that Flight 55, a Continental DC-10, caused the crash of Air France Concorde Flight 4590 in Paris. The DC-10 dropped a strip of titanium alloy from its thrust reverser on the runway during takeoff. When AF 4590 subsequently departed, Concorde's left main landing gear tires struck the strip of metal and were punctured. The tires then exploded and tire rubber fragments penetrated Concorde's wing fuel tanks, starting fires in engines 1 and 2, leading to the crash which killed all aboard and 4 people on the ground. According to the official report on the accident, the strip of metal installed on the Continental jet was made from a different alloy than had been approved by the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration or the engine manufacturer. This led French authorities to undertake a criminal investigation into Continental Airlines, which ended in Continental being fined €200,000 in order to pay €1 million to Air France. On March 1, 2001, Continental launched a non-stop service from Newark to Hong Kong, operating over the North Circumpolar route. It was the first non-stop long-haul route for any airline with flying duration exceeding 16 hours. The service initiated a brief dispute between Continental, United Airlines and Cathay Pacific over rights to non-stop flights between Hong Kong and New York. On September 13, 2004, Continental entered the SkyTeam Alliance along with Northwest/KLM and CSA. In 2005, Continental expanded service from Newark to Beijing after being awarded the China route. Among U.S. airlines, only Delta with its extensive network of legacy routes dating from Delta's acquisition of Pan American's European network served more European destinations than Continental. In 2005, service to Asia was expanded as Continental introduced daily non-stop service between Newark and New Delhi, India. The success of this Newark-New Delhi route presaged establishment of a second gateway in India with the announcement of daily non-stop service to Mumbai. With the establishment of Mumbai service, Continental offered the most non-stop flights by any carrier from the United States to India. On January 16, 2006, a mechanic standing near a Boeing 737 at El Paso International Airport in Texas was sucked into one of the engines and killed. The mechanic's failure to maintain proper clearance with the engine intake during a jet engine run, and the failure of contract maintenance personnel to follow written procedures and directives contained in the airline's general maintenance manual were determined to be the cause. Factors contributing to the accident were the insufficient training provided to the contract mechanics by the airline, and the failure of the airport to disseminate a policy prohibiting ground engine runs above idle power in the terminal area. By May 2006, the carrier's passenger traffic surpassed that of Northwest Airlines, and Continental became the fourth largest U.S. carrier. On October 28, 2006, Continental Flight 1883, a Boeing 757-200 aircraft carrying 160 passengers, landed on a narrow unoccupied taxiway parallel to runway 29 at Newark Liberty International Airport. No one was injured and both pilots were removed from flying status duties pending an investigation. They have since been reinstated. Potentially confusing runway lighting and pilot error were cited in the investigation. The Wall Street Journal reported on December 12, 2007, that Continental was in merger discussions with United Airlines. Of issue would be Continental's golden share held by Northwest Airlines in the divestiture of Continental's Guamanian hub. A deal was not certain or imminent, with the talks being of a preliminary nature. In April 2008, at the height of oil prices, Northwest announced a merger with Delta Air Lines. This allowed Continental to buy back the golden share from Northwest Airlines, which it did. Continental then renewed merger talks with United Airlines, but broke them off again that same month. In February 2008, Ewell Corporation and Continental Airlines began the advanced stages of merger talks and were expected to announce their decision in the immediate aftermath of a definitive merger agreement between rival Delta Air Lines and Northwest Airlines. The timing of the events was notable because Northwest's golden shares in Continental that gave Northwest veto authority against any merger involving Continental could be redeemed, freeing Continental to pursue a marriage with United. On April 27, 2008, Continental broke off merger negotiations with United and stated it was going to stand alone. Despite ending merger talks, Continental announced that it would join United in the Star Alliance. United and U.S. Airways were in advanced merger talks in late April 2008, following the announcement that Continental had broken off talks with United. In June 2008, the CEOs of both United and Continental signed an alliance pact that led to their eventual merger. The alliance was an agreement to link international networks and share technology and passenger perks. This agreement was termed a virtual merger as it included many of the benefits of a merger without the actual costs and restructuring involved. The alliance took effect about a year after Delta Air Lines and Northwest Airlines completed their merger, as that released Continental from the SkyTeam contract and allowed for the required 9-month notice. Additionally, Continental joined the Star Alliance, as Delta and Northwest merged. In May 2008, Continental Airlines sold its remaining 4.38 million share investment in Panamanian flag carrier Copa for $35.75 a share, netting proceeds of $149.8 million. Continental had been a principal shareholder in Copa. In June 2008, due to national and international economic conditions, Continental cut 3,000 jobs and the CEO and president had reduced salaries for the remainder of the year. The airline also reduced capacity and eliminated 67 mainline aircraft from its fleet by the end of 2009, retiring all of Continental's 737-300s and all but 35 of its 737-500s. Continental also announced that it planned to withdraw from SkyTeam and would join Star Alliance in order to cooperate more extensively with United Airlines and other Star Alliance airlines. The new Continental-United relationship was characterized as a virtual merger in some circles. In September 2008, Continental announced that it would commence providing seasonal nonstop service between Houston and Rio de Janeiro. The new nonstop flight was timed to provide round-trip flight connections at Continental's Houston hub to more than 160 cities throughout the U.S., Canada, Central America, Europe, and Asia. Continental renewed its lease for around 450,000 square feet in Continental Center. Continental announced that its fourth quarter 2008 net loss widened to $266 million on costs for pilot retirement and reducing the value of its fuel hedges. On December 20, 2008, Flight 1404 bound for Houston pulled left and ran off of the runway during its takeoff roll at Denver International Airport. The cause of the incident is unknown, however the right side of aircraft caught fire once coming to a stop. Of the 115 people on board, 47 sustained injuries, with 2 seriously injured, including the pilot. In January 2009, Continental became the first commercial carrier to successfully demonstrate the use of sustainable biofuel to power an aircraft in North America. During the demonstration flight, Continental's test pilots successfully conducted a number of flight maneuvers, and the biofuel met all performance requirements as compared with traditional jet fuel. The biofuel blend included components derived from algae and jatropha plants, both sustainable, second-generation sources that do not impact food crops or water resources or contribute to deforestation. In March 2009, Continental became the first U.S. carrier to inaugurate scheduled service between New York and Shanghai, China, with daily nonstop flights from Newark. In June 2009, Continental took delivery of another new Boeing 737-900ER, which was painted with a retro livery to commemorate the airline's 75th anniversary. The livery, which was originally used on aircraft beginning in 1947 and is called the Blue Skyway, was selected by Continental employees. Continental flew the aircraft to its 3 hubs for anniversary celebration events for employees and retirees. Post-merger, United maintained the livery, but on a different 737-900ER than the aircraft originally carrying it. On June 18, 2009, the captain of Continental Airlines Flight 61, a Boeing 777-200ER, en route from Brussels, Belgium, to Newark, New Jersey, died of natural causes during the trip. The airline alerted federal authorities around 10:30 that morning that Flight 61 was being flown by the first officer and relief pilot. The plane with 247 passengers aboard landed safely at Newark Liberty International Airport at about noon EDT. In July 2009, Continental began to offer DirecTV, giving customers the choice of 95 channels of live television programming, more channels than any other carrier. Continental also launched virtual expert technology on their website at continental.com, offering customers 24-hour support on the web for all their travel needs. Continental was the first airline to use this technology. On August 3, 2009, Continental Flight 128, a Boeing 767, made an emergency landing in Miami due to extreme turbulence. This flight was scheduled from Rio de Janeiro to Houston. The plane carried 11 crew members and 168 passengers. At least 26 passengers were injured, including 4 seriously. In late half of 2009, Continental Airlines became the first airline to launch a mobile boarding pass service to London's Heathrow. The service allowed customers to receive boarding passes electronically on their mobile phones or PDAs. Continental Airlines left the SkyTeam Alliance on October 24, 2009, and joined Star Alliance on October 27, 2009. On January 1, 2010, Jeff Smisek, former president and COO, became the CEO of Continental Airlines. Continental also planned to start seasonal nonstop service between Portland International Airport and Ted Stevens International Airport, putting Continental in direct competition with former partner Alaska Airlines. The route was scheduled to start on June 10, 2010. On February 16, Continental, along with its wholly owned subsidiary Continental Micronesia, announced that it applied for nonstop flights to Tokyo Haneda as part of an open skies agreement between the U.S. and Japan. United was reported to be in serious merger discussion with U.S. Airways in early April 2010. A New York Times report indicated that a deal was close. Union consent was cited as a major hurdle for negotiators to clear. On April 22, 2010, United announced that it would not pursue a merger with U.S. Airways. On May 2, 2010, the board of directors at Continental and United approved a stock swap deal that would combine them into the world's largest airline in revenue passenger miles. The new airline would take on United's name, Continental's logo, and be based in United's hometown of Chicago. The new United would be run by Continental's CEO, Jeff Smisek, along with United's CEO, Glenn Tilton, serving as non-executive chairman of the board. The deal received approval from U.S. and European regulators in the summer of 2010. The shareholders of both airlines approved the deal on September 17, 2010. Both airlines had been reporting losses in the recession and expected the merger to generate savings of more than $1 billion a year. In August 2010, Continental and United revealed a new logo that was used after the merger was complete. Both carriers planned to begin merging operations in 2011 and were expected to receive a single operating certificate by 2012. Continental's Air Operator's Certificate was retained, while those of United and Continental Micronesia were surrendered. On the other hand, United's Maintenance Certificate remained while Continental's did not. On October 1, 2010, Ewell Corporation and Continental completed the planned merger and changed the name to United Continental Holdings. Although the two airlines remained separate until the operational integration was completed by mid-2012, as of that day both airlines were corporately controlled by the same leadership. On December 6, 2010, Continental was found criminally responsible for the disaster to Concorde Air France Flight 4590 at Gonesse on July 25, 2000, an accident that killed 100 passengers and 9 crew members on board the plane, and 4 persons on the ground by a Parisian court, and was fined €200,000 $271,620 HU.S. in order to pay Air France €1 million. Continental mechanic John Taylor was given a 15-month suspended sentence, while another airline operative and 3 French officials were cleared of all charges. The court ruled that the crash resulted from a piece of metal from a Continental jet that was left on the runway. The object punctured a tire on the Concorde and then ruptured a fuel tank. Another Continental employee, Stanley Ford, was found not guilty. On November 29, 2012, a French appeals court overturned that decision, thereby clearing Continental of criminal responsibility. On December 22, 2010, Continental Airlines merged operating certificates with Continental Micronesia. All Continental Micronesia flights were then branded and operated by Continental Airlines. Both carriers began merging their operations in 2011. On March 22, UCH announced that they had plans to offer Wi-Fi service on more than 200 domestic Boeing 737 and 757 aircraft. The airlines attained a single operating certificate from the FAA on November 30, 2011. That day, all Continental flights began to use the United callsign in air traffic control communications, which marked the end of Continental Airlines. The new United is the third largest airline in terms of fleet size, behind American Airlines and Delta. The combined airline houses a fleet of over 1,280 aircraft that features a mixture of Airbus and Boeing aircraft, Airbus A319s, Airbus A320s, Boeing 737s, Boeing 757s, Boeing 767s, Boeing 777s, and Boeing 787 Dreamliners with orders of Airbus A350s. At the time of the merger with United, Continental was the 4th largest airline in the U.S. based on passenger miles flown and the 5th largest in total passengers carried. Continental operated flights to destinations throughout the U.S., Canada, Latin America, Europe, and the Asia-Pacific regions. Principal operations were from its 4 hubs at Newark Liberty International Airport, George Bush Intercontinental Airport, Cleveland Hopkins International Airport, and Antonio B. Pat International Airport in Guam. The only Continental hubs to be rebranded are Cleveland Hopkins International Airport and Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport. The Newark hub began the rebranding process on October 19, 2011, with all United-operated ticket counters and gates to be rebranded in Phase 1. Phase 2 of rebranding at Newark began in 2012 with Continental ticket counters and gates to be rebranded. On November 30, 2011, Continental officially merged with United and no longer operates as a separate airline. On March 3, 2012, Continental's passenger reservation system and frequent flyer program was merged into United. The last Continental Airlines flight taking off was Continental Flight 1267, flying from Phoenix to Cleveland, and arriving into the latter as United Flight 1267. United Airlines Incorporated merged into Continental Airlines Incorporated, with Continental Airlines Incorporated being the surviving corporate entity and a wholly owned subsidiary of the UL Corporation, on March 31, 2013. The name of Continental Airlines Incorporated was changed to United Airlines Incorporated. On June 27, 2019, United changed its parent company name from United Continental Holdings to United Airlines Holdings.
If you can't fly Continental, you might as well not fly. If you can't fly Continental, we'll miss you in the sky. If you can't fly Continental, who will treat you the way we do? If you can't fly Continental, who's gonna move their tail for you? If you can't fly Continental,
try to have a nice trip
If you have
anyway.
any fond memories, please indicate it at the comments below. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and like.